Hey everybody, Timothy here. We're continuing our review of Battle for Zendikar, this time with the green cards. Now, green in this set looks pretty good. It looks like it would do well on its own, and it looks like it does very well as a supporting color for a lot of the other themes of the set. So let's jump right in, and we're starting off with a very good card. Unnatural Aggression is a 3-mana instant. Instant being the important part here. Target creature you control fights an opponent's creature, and if the opponent's creature dies this turn, you exile it instead. This does everything you want in a green spell. Usually fight spells give you some sort of power boost. I'm thinking of Hunt the Weak, Wild Instincts, cards like that, Savage Punch, but instant speed makes a huge difference. The potential to blow out your opponent in green usually sways games in your favor, and the exile clause is also very relevant in this set. So this is a card that I can easily see first picking in a otherwise bad pack, in much the same ways you would a lot of other green fight spells. Instant speed, though, is very good for fight abilities. Sometimes it leads to unfavorable results for you, but if you time it correctly, it should be very good. Eyeless Watcher is a 4-mana 1/1 that enters the battlefield and makes 2 additional Eldrazi Scion. So you're getting a total of 3/3 for 4, which is fine, but the potential to ramp on the following turn is really where this guy plays his role. So assuming you have 4 lands to play this, the following turn, if you play a land, you have access to 7 mana, and you can probably get Eyeless Watcher out even earlier than turn 4, so these cards ramp into each other very well. This one, sending you from 4 mana to 7 mana, is very relevant and lets you drop a very early big threat. So even though he's just a 1/1 himself, I think the card is quite valuable. Call of the Scions, not the most exciting card here. It's a sorcery speed, 3 mana, make 2 Eldrazi Scion, and that's all it does. Sorcery speed for me is a pretty big deal here. The card is playable, and it's basically a ramp spell if you think about it. Paying 3 mana just for 2 power over 2 bodies is not that great. If you have a plan for these creatures, for instance, if you have sack outlets, or if you're just using them to ramp into like a 6-drop very early on, then the card is fine. It would probably make the cut in most of my decks, even though it's not the most exciting card in the world. Blister Pod is exactly what I want in a 1-drop. It's basically Tukatang Thallid here, but the token is more useful. It's a 1/1 for 1. When it dies, you put an Eldrazi Scion out. Tukatang was very good. It soaks up damage, essentially being 2 blockers over the span of 2 turns. This one, your opponent's going to let through more often, so it gets to ping for 1. They might not want you to have the Eldrazi Scion early on in the game, so you can probably get a little bit of damage in with this one too. And if it does die, you get a useful token out of it, essentially ramping you ahead. Blister Pod is everything I want in a 1-mana card, and it works very well with the sacrifice outlets, so I can see green and black going together very well in this set. Follow that up with Snappin' Gnarlid. This is a bear with landfall +1/+1, and some rather uninspired art, in my opinion, but I can't say that really. I couldn't draw anything better than this. But yeah, 2/2 for 2 is fine. We do get a bear, and this can start attacking for 3 on turn 3. So essentially a 2-mana 3/3 most of the times on offense is a fine playable card. And at the very least, in worst case scenario, if you're not constantly triggering landfall, it's still a 2/2 for 2, and it makes the cut almost all the time. Territorial Bailoff being the endgame version of the same card, really. I believe this is a reprint with different art from the original Zendikar block. A 4/4 for 5 that gets +2/+2 with landfall. So if you're consistently hitting your lands, this is a 6/6 for 5. Even a 4/4 for 5 would be a decent card, if not the most unexciting card. But when you are attacking as a 6/6 for 5, that's where you really start to get the chumps in, and your opponent can't take too many turns of just letting a 6/6 in. There are some really neat tricks in this set that let you put lands onto the battlefield either instant speed or put multiple lands out at the same time, and that's where cards like this become extremely threatening. If you attack with this and you have open mana, your opponent needs to be aware of those tricks, since this can do quite a bit of damage with its landfall triggers. Tajuru Stalwart is a 3-mana 0/1. Enter the battlefield with a 1/1 counter for each color of mana spent to cast it. So a Converge creature. It is an ally. That's worth note. Now, this guy, if you're spending 2 colors to cast it, you get a 2/3. And as we've already seen, there are tons of 3/2s and tons of 2/3s. So a 2/3 for 3 is just fine of a card. If, however, you manage to spend all 3 colors to cast it, it becomes actually quite good. A 3/4 for 3 is ahead of the game, and it trumps those 3/2s and 2/3s quite well. So really, you want to be playing this if you can reliably cast it for 2 colors, and if you can get 3 colors off of it, you've got a very good common at your hands. If for some reason you're stuck with this in hand and you only have access to 1 color, it is a pretty bad card though. Seek the Wilds, 2-mana sorcery. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a creature or a land, and put it into your hand. The rest go to the bottom of the library. So it doesn't feel graveyard shenanigans, but there aren't too many graveyard things going on in this set. Also, I believe this is the art for the playmat for GP Atlanta, which I'll be going to. Would make very nice art for a playmat. At any rate, these types of spells usually cost 2 to 3 mana, and they're almost always playable. Very few of them have been unplayable, and there's almost always a card like this in every set. I do like that in a set that encourages you to play more than 2 color decks with things like Converge and Allies, that this can find you a land that you might be missing pretty early on. And if you don't find a land or you don't need one, you can just grab a creature with it. I wouldn't overload on these. 1 is just fine, and the more colors I'm playing, if I'm base green, the more of these I might want. But as a 1-of, it'd be fine in almost any deck I'm playing. Now, this is a combat trick for the set. Swell of Growth, 2-mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+2. And the very exciting part of this card, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Normally, that would be a little bit of a meh clause, but in a Landfall set, that seems quite insane. So when your creatures are getting bigger off of Landfall, and they're already getting bigger off of this +2/+2, Swell of Growth can account for a lot of damage. Imagine this on the Territorial Baloth, which gets +2/+2 off the land coming in and +2/+2 off this card, or other relevant landfall triggers that deal damage or cause some sort of ability to activate. This is a very good instant, and I would be happy playing multiples of these. It does empty your hand very quickly, and it is also a ramp card. You can use it on turn 2 just to get an additional land onto the battlefield and push in damage and ramp from 2 to 4 like that. So it's very versatile. It's a combat trick and a ramp spell in once, and a very good one at that. Tajuru Beastmaster is a 6-mana 5/5. Decent card on just the vanilla test. It is an ally with Rally. When it or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, your creatures get +1/+1 for the turn. I think this is a very good curve topper for any ally deck. And any deck that can play green, really this is a fine curve topper by itself. It gives you immediate value when it enters. It triggers its own rally ability, so everything gets +1/+1. And in a green deck, that means you're just pushing in lots of damage. If you are playing it alongside other allies, then your allies become that much better, giving your whole team a pump. This card seems very solid for a common. I'd be happy having it almost any green deck that can support it. Plummet with new art to destroy target creature with flying, instant speed. Stays in the sideboard, but when it comes in, it kills things that are relevant. And I will use this phrase again, do not underestimate the power of a late game flyer. Plummet is just what you need to take down those late game flyers, some of which are rare, some of which are common. So Plummet is a card that you always want to have access in. If you get down to the end of a pack and you're in green and there's Plummet and a bunch of other non-playable green spells, I would usually take the good sideboard card like Plummet. And speaking of sideboard cards, we get very bad naturalize, but a card that you usually at least want to have access to. Reclaiming Vines is a 4-mana sorcery. Destroy an artifact, enchantment, or land. Now, you really don't want to use this as land destruction. Now, I imagine there are going to be a lot of newbie players who put this in their main deck and destroy your lands with it, and it'll be frustrating. But this card should never be main deck. You really only bring it in if there's a very problematic card for you. Honestly, if your opponent has some random artifact, that's not enough to bring a card like this in, especially for 4 mana. It needs to be an artifact or enchantment or even a land that is very problematic. I'll make the same claim for this that I did for the Volcanic instant speed red card that destroys a land, in that Awaken is a mechanic in this set, so being able to destroy a land is sometimes equivalent to destroying a creature in this set, but that's not always relevant, and that's not even always enough for me to want to bring this card in. What I can see bringing this card in against is the retreats, or are the retreats. Almost all of the retreats give long-term value, and getting them off the field may be worth bringing Reclaiming Vines into. Otherwise, keep it in the sideboard unless you absolutely need it. Oran Reef Invoker. This is a 2-mana 2/2, so we're fine on that front. Already a playable card. It's another late game card. This isn't a full cycle. It's more of a shout out, I think, to the original 8-mana activation cards from Zendikar block. But this one for 8 mana gives target creature a +5/+5 boost and trample for the turn. So in board stalls or in games where you just need to push in a lot of damage, this lady will get the trick done for you. The same way the red card can ping for 3 damage a turn or just toss lightning bolts around, +5/+5 and trample is a very relevant ability, especially when you can repeat it and get in. Cards like this are very awesome, cards that fill the curve and are good on turn 2 and good on turn 8. It's the turns in between where this card doesn't really shine, but having access into to this sort of effect in your deck can definitely push you over the top. Follow that up with Natural Connection. It's a 3-mana instant, and it's easy to hate this card because it's Rampant Growth effect, but it's not Rampant Growth by any means. I think there are a couple things going for it. First off, Mana Fixin' is Mana Fixin' even when it's bad. If you need access to Mana Fixin', cards like this will do it for you. So you can't completely write it off in that regard. Sometimes you don't want an effect like this, and that's fine. Second thing, Converge is in this set, and allies support multiple colors, so having access to Mana Fixin' like this on turn 3 can definitely set up your later game, and assuming you have this and maybe one other color by the time you play it, this will give you access to a third color, which means all your Converge spells are essentially 3+ on the Converge count. Third thing, this is, again, instant speed land. Landfall triggers, and as with Swell of Growth, that is something that probably should not be underestimated. So I think this card is actually much more appealing than people are giving it credit for, even if it's not Rampant Growth. It's easy to compare it to a lower casting cost card that does the same thing, but this does it at instant speed and in a set where multiple colors are encouraged, and I think that makes a huge difference. It's definitely not better than Rampant Growth, but I don't think it should be compared to Rampant Growth in the same regard. Next we get Life Spring Druid, a 3-mana 2/1. Add any color of mana to your mana pool. So this is a late mana elf that starts setting up your other turns, and I think it's good for the same reasons that the previous card were good. Natural Connection. Sorry, I'm still trying to memorize the names here. But even though this is a late mana elf and it's not going to make a huge difference on curve when you play it, and you might actually be behind by the time you play it, it sets up your later games. It makes it makes allies and Converge a little bit more manageable, and at the very least it's still ramp. So if you play this on turn 3, then you have access to a 5-drop on your next turn, which is not relevant. This can be used on any spells as well, not just creature spells, so it it fits very well into multicolored decks, but I think I would be fine taking it in any green deck. I'm reluctant to say that this is a top pick common, because usually you want your mana elves, and this is actually an elf, you want your mana dorks to be 2 or less mana, but if this is what you have access to for mana fixing and ramp, then that's just fine as well. So I'd be happy taking this. I don't know if it's something that I should call a top pick common, but I'm leaning towards yes on that front. Let me know what you think. Is Lifespring Druid a top pick green common for you? Would you take it very highly? What other cards would you take over it? I'm leaning towards yes, I would take it quite highly. Earthen Arms is interesting, and I want to make a comparison to Cachet Defenses here. First off, Earthen Arms is a 2-mana sorcery. Put 2 1/1 counters on any target permanent. It doesn't have to be just a creature. You can put it on, I don't know, Gideon if you're attacking with it, anything like that. And then we also have Awaken here. For 7, you make a 4/4. Now, you can put those two effects together if you're paying 7 mana for this and make a 6/6 land. That doesn't seem like the best thing in the world. Usually this is just going to be run out as a 2-drop rather than a 7-drop. 7's quite a bit for this effect. But I do want to make the comparison to Cachet Defenses. A lot of times in Fate Reforged, this was a very underrated card. If you played a 1 or 2-drop and then on turn 3 you played Cachet Defenses, you had an absolute beast of a creature on turn 3. And it could start attacking on turn 3. Often a 5/5 attacking on turn 3, and your opponent was way, way behind, had to start chumping, had to find an answer very, very quickly. Earthen Arms isn't quite 3 counters, it's only 2 counters, but you get to choose where it goes. Bolster was always on your weakest creature, which by turn 3 was usually only 1 creature. But I do want to give a shout out to Earthen Arms. I think it's going to be a little bit underrated, if not complete. It's not a busted card. It's only 2 counters, but that can push you way ahead. It can make one of your early creatures a threat that needs to be dealt with very early on, and if not, your opponent's going to be very far behind. So I would be fine running this as a one-of. I don't know that I would ever hold on to it for the Awaken cost, but it is nice to have this flexibility in a card that not only makes another creature, but makes one of the creatures you already have better. So it adds a lot of power to the board with Awaken. But usually I would be fine just running it out on an early drop and making an early game threat. Moving on, we've got Giant Mantis, which is just a standard spider. 4 mana 2/4 with reach. These type of cards are always fine. Blue and white have some pretty good flyers that this takes care of. A lot of 2/3s and 3/2 flyers. And Giant Mantis is going to deal with them pretty well. Reach is just a very nice ability to have access to. This does become worse in the late game when it's not doing anything, and if the flyers get out of range of it, it becomes a little worse. But just like Hitchclaw Recluse or any other thing that can block flyer, this is nice to have access to. And 4 mana for this kind of threshold of power, toughness, and reach is quite reasonable. Brood Hunter Worm, another vanilla creature here. This is a 4 mana 4/3. We've already mentioned how many 4/3s and 3/4s there are, also how many 3/2s and 2/3s there are. At 4 mana, this card is just fine. It's often just going to trade for a couple creatures or 1 creature. Like I've said in some of the other videos, I think there's going to be a lot of creature trading back and forth in this set because of this power toughness distribution. This seems like a fine pickup. I would be happy playing it in almost any green deck, and I think it's very rarely going to get cut. Alright, moving into the uncommons, we've got a processor here in green. Void Attendant is a 3 mana 2/3. See, we just said lots of 2/3s, 3/2s, 3/4s, 4/3s, etc. So this is fine as a vanilla creature. For 2 mana, green and 1, you process a card and put an Eldrazi Scion on. Now, if you are in the type of deck where you can repeatedly throw your opponent's cards into exile, if you've got that sort of effect, for instance, if you're playing this alongside blue with a lot of the evasive ingest creatures, this becomes a very real ability, and you can activate it multiple times per turn, starting on turn 4. You can even use the Scions to start cycling through and repeating it, even though that doesn't seem too beneficial. But having access to this sort of ability lets you dump a lot of creatures on the field, which can do quite a few things. It lets you go wide, it lets you ramp really quickly, and it lets you take advantage of sacrifice outlets. So there's a lot going for this. I see green pairing very well with blue for cards like this, and I see green pairing very well with black for sacrifice fodder. This is everything I want in a token generator. Although you do have to be aware of the fact that you have to consistently get cards into your opponent's exile zone in order to repeat this effect. Alright, Brood Monitor, 6 mana for a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 Eldrazi Scions. So, total that up, you get 6 power, 6 toughness for 6. That's perfectly on curve. This is the hatchling of the format. I think this is going to be a very good card. I think this is going to be a very high pick as well. I can see myself first picking this very often. There are some 8 through 10 drops in this format that a lot of times they're going to be a little unrealistic in a deck. 10 mana is still a lot even if you're ramping. But this guy gets you from 6 mana to potentially 9 or 10 mana on the following turn. And in some worst case scenarios, you get 4 bodies. 4 bodies for 6 mana is very good. If you're behind, this card is fine as well, giving you 4 blockers. And if you're ahead, spreading out that damage does quite a bit. This is good for all the same reasons that any other token generator is good. Any other Eldrazi Scion generator is good. But this one does it very well. And this is exactly what you want in any sort of wide token-based strategy or ramp of deck. Now, Sythe Leopard, card I'm not as excited about. This is a 1/1 that pushes in a lot of damage in the early game, but becomes a little bit irrelevant in the late game. It's a landfall creature. It gets 1/1 until end of turn with landfall. So starting on turn 1, if you drop this, it basically attacks for 2. If you can drop multiple lands in a turn, it attacks for more, obviously. But for the most part, this is technically valued as like a 2/2 for 1, which is usually very good. I don't usually like cards like this, cards that are significantly better on turn 1 than they are on any other turn in the game. Unless you're using the instant speed tricks to put lands on the battlefield and trade this up in combat, I don't think it's something that really justifies being an uncommon. It's usually got to push in a good bit of damage though. It's very similar in its effect to as Goblin Glory Chaser is in Origins, which is a card I very much dislike because its biggest appeal is being on the play, playing it on turn 1. Sythe Leopard is a little bit better than Goblin Glory Chaser, but like I said, in the late game, this sort of card becomes irrelevant when you're starting to slow down on your land drops, when a 1/1 or a 2/2 is no longer getting in damage. Sythe Leopard needs to start hitting early and fast to be a relevant card, and it fits the curve just fine. If you get it on turn 1, it's great. If you get it later in the game, it's not so great. I would be fine playing it, but I wouldn't want to go all in on this sort of creature. Rot Shambler, however, is a card I'm like quite a bit. This sort of effect is usually very good. This is a 2-mana 1/1. When another creature dies, that's any creature on either side of the battlefield. When another creature dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Rot Shambler. First off, he starts off very slow, but with all of the Eldrazi Scions, every time you sack an Eldrazi Scion or your opponent sacks one, this guy gets a counter. Anytime a trade happens in combat, this guy's getting 2 counters, and so on and so forth. If you're playing him in black and you're using sacrifice outlets, this guy starts getting strong very quickly, and he's something your opponent's going to have to deal with right away. A lot of times, this sort of card is a lightning magnet. You will play it, and your opponent will blow whatever removal they have available to take care of it before it gets out of hand. If they can't do that, and this starts becoming a 3/3, 4/4, 5/5, which it will very quickly, then you've got a huge threat, and you really only paid 2 mana to do it. This plays very well along Eldrazi Scion, and this sort of effect is usually very good on a card like this. Alright, we get an ally here with a pretty big payoff. So, a 5-mana 2/1. This is very weak on its own. This is one of the few unplayable allies. Actually, that's incorrect. Let me take that statement back. This is one of the few just base allies that aren't too good on their own. Now, this one has Rally. When it enters the battlefield, all of your creatures get +2/+2. If you're not playing in an ally deck, it's good once. +2/+2 on a body for your entire team is good. So I will recant that statement that this is not good on its own. You do get value out of it the turn you play by pumping the rest of your team +2/+2. If, however, you can reliably continue to trigger it with allies, the card becomes insane. Being able to give your entire team +2/+2 on almost every turn, if not every other turn, is huge. There are some spells that put multiple allies on the field at the same time. That's when this card becomes busted. For instance, I can't remember the white card's name, but it's a Converge spell that puts a core ally out for every color mana you spend on it. If you're casting that for even 3 mana, which is not the maximum, that's giving your entire team +6/+6. I'll just let that sink in. This card has huge upside, huge upside, and I'm actually quite sorry that I just doubted you for a second. So we're going to become acquainted quite well, Warcaller. Moving on, Sylvan Skrine. This is, I think, a reprint that's a little more exciting for Constructed than it is for Limited, but it's fine in Limited. Sylvan Skrine is 2 mana sorcery. You grab any land from your deck, put it into your hand. Now, it doesn't put it on the battlefield, so if you're playing this on turn 2, it doesn't really ramp you. If you're playing it on turn 3, then you can play that land, obviously. But this is kind of a role filler in that it grabs the color that you're missing, it grabs your splash color, it does everything that Evolving Wilds does, but in the form of a sorcery. It has the added benefit of being able to grab any land, not just a basic land. There is a cycle of lands that we'll see in another video that have additional effects, some of which are quite good, and Sylvan Skrine can give you access to that in a pinch. This is never a dead card, but sometimes it's not very good. You want to play on turn 2 when you're not under pressure, and you want to make your mana better by doing it. So I'd be fine having access to Sylvan Skrine, but I don't think, again, I think it's a little more potent and constructed than it is in Limited, even though it's a fine playable card in Limited. Plated Crusher, so we get a big dumb beast here. 7 mana, triple green for the casting cost. So this is going a heavy green deck. We get a 7/6 with trample and hexproof. Hexproof, I think this is the only hexproof card in the set. Hexproof is a very strong ability. It works extremely well with fight abilities. So the first card we saw, this is a great target for it. This is a great target for auras. Basically, your opponent's not going to be able to remove this thing except in combat or in very clutch situations with certain sacrifice effects. Now, 6 toughness, I think, is a little underwhelming. This card is huge, but it can be blocked. Like, you can get rid of it with multiple blocks. So if you are just sending this in the red zone and your opponent has enough to double, triple block it off, either you're going to want to make sure you have some combat trick to make this guy survive and get the most out of him, or you may just be fine doing a 2-for-1 or 3-for-1, which is okay for a 7-drop. The mana restrictions are expensive. It does have trample, but hexproof is really the appeal of this guy, and I think I would be quite happy playing this. Even though it's triple green with the Eldrazi Scions floating around, this guy can easily come down turn 4 or turn 5. So I don't think it's unrealistic to get this big fatty into play and just wreck your opponent with it from there. J offshoot, as I will henceforth call it. It's a turn 1 card, a 1 mana 0/3 defender. Landfall gives you a life. This fits very well in black decks where the life gain is relevant for some of the vampire creatures. Outside of that, I think it's a fine playable card, but it's not the most exciting card. I would be okay playing this, but it's not something I would want to draw in the late game. Same problem with a lot of 1-drops. This one doesn't have a wholly significant effect in the late game or even the mid game. It just kind of gets run over. It blocks well in the early game, and I'd be fine just throwing it in front of like a 2/2 to see if my opponent wants to waste a combat trick to get rid of something like this. That's something that comes up quite often. I would be fine trading the offshoot for a combat trick, but outside of life gain strategies or extreme aggressive matchups, I don't think I want to mainboard this card. If I'm hurting for early game, I would mainboard it. But if I have a decent early game between my 1, 2, and 3 drops, I think I would leave this in the sideboard. Murasa Ranger is a 4-mana 3/3. We've got a lot of 4-mana 3/3s with upside in this set. This one, when a land enters the battlefield, you can pay 4 to put 2+1/+1 counters on it. Now that ability curves quite well. You play this for 4 and on the following turn you have access to this if you play a land. It's kind of putting all your eggs in one basket if you're repeatedly using your mana to pump this guy up, but he does get 2 counters and that gets out of hand very quickly. So starting on turn 5, assuming you're playing on curve without ramp, you have access to a 5/5 if everything works out well, and then after that 7/7, so on and so forth. I wouldn't value too many of these guys. Really, you don't want multiples. You kind of want to make... This is a very Theros-esque card in that you want to make one huge threat. But if your opponent has a removal spell for it, it becomes worse. It is worth noting, and this is something that should have been mentioned earlier, most of the removal in this set is damage-based, with the exception of cards like Bone Splinters. There are very few non-rare cards that just destroy a target creature. Most of them have to deal an amount of damage. So things like this that become 5/5s and then 7/7s and so on and so forth, they're going to be hard for a lot of decks to deal with outside of things like Death Touch or Bounce spells. So maybe this guy is actually the real deal. And by guy, I mean gal. But I think it's just a fine card, not a completely insane bomb or anything like that. Infused with the Elements, again, another combat trick that I think is quite awesome. We get a 4-mana instant with Converge, put X+1/+1 counters on it. X is the number of colors you spent. There's another additional effect that creature gains trample until end of turn. So if you're playing this on your turn, the trample part's relevant. If you're playing it as a combat trick on your opponent's turn, that last part's not relevant. This can give, at instant speed, +4/+4 permanently in the form of counters, and that is very good. As with Converge, I think you want to get, for these 4-mana Converge spells, I think you want to get 75% of the potential out of it, and by that I mean you want to cast this for 3 colors, if not 4, to get as much value as possible out of this. You could play this in a 2-color deck and get 2 counters, and that would still be a playable card at instant speed, but not an amazing one. Games can probably just end with this card, given the trample and the +4/+4 potential. I think it's a very good combat trick, but it's only going to fit into certain decks. Green does have the tools to make Converge work the best, and I think that's worth considering. Make sure that you're aware this card exists when you go to your pre-releases and you see your opponent with 4 mana up, different colors, and they're attacking in a weird manner. This is probably what you need to watch out for. Alright, and we get our green retreat. I believe this is the last uncommon here. The landfall trigger on this one, it's 3 mana to play. The landfall trigger either puts a 1/1 counter on a creature or you gain 2 life. Now, this is kind of turning your lands into Radiant Fountains, and that's just fine if you're in an aggressive matchup, but I think you really want to be using the +1/+1 counters whenever possible. Unless you're really hurting on life and you're just getting beat down. The 2 life gain is a little bit slow, but not irrelevant. But making your lands into little mini pump spells is quite good. The same way turning your lands into little burn spells, even if it's a little bit at a time, really helps in an attrition-y match. I will make a correction to something I said in the video, the white release, and I was talking about Felidar Cub. I said there aren't too many targets for the enchantment removal, but these retreats are all valuable targets, so I might have said that earlier in this video with the 4-mana removal spell, but the Felidar Cub is quite good against these retreats, and this one is kind of on the weaker end compared to the others, but the value you get over the course of a game is quite good, and not to be underestimated by any means. Alright, moving on to the rares. We get a Devoid Enchantment here. From Beyond, 4 mana, 1 green, 3. Beginning of your upkeep, you get an Eldrazi Scion. And then for 2 mana, you can sacrifice From Beyond, search your library for an Eldrazi, put it into your hand. This is quite good. Amazing, actually. It's a little bit more expensive than Awakening Zone, but it has a relevant late game ability. First off, getting a 1/1 every turn. Sure, you take turn 4 off to play this, but that helps whether you're behind or ahead, making this a good card. A chump blocker every turn for a problematic creature, or an additional attacker, or an additional creature entering the battlefield, or even an additional ramp every turn is very good. So in ideal circumstances, you can just build up an army of Scions, and when you're ready, go fetch your huge Eldrazi finisher and play it quite easily off the Scions you've acquired. A lot of times I'll see this as just making a 1/1 for chumping, so that you can make combat easier for you. But ideally, if you get this out on turn 4 and your opponent doesn't have an immediate response for it, you should be able to overtake the game quite easily. Over the course of a full game, especially in kind of an even matchup or a mid-range late-game matchup, this will account for quite a bit of mana that you're not actually spending. You can start casting your spells from your hand and use the Scions to take care of other things. So very good. I would definitely take this first pick anytime I saw it. And this is Renewal. 6 mana. Search for 3 basic lands, put them on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Gain 7 life. Normally, this would be a very unexciting card. This is the type of thing I would expect to see in Origins and pass quite often, but this is not Origins. This is Battle for Zendikar, where Landfall is a thing, and 3 landfall triggers off of 1 card is not irrelevant. Sure, it's 6 mana for a mana ramp, but when you're playing 8, 9, and 10 drops, that might be what you want. The 7 life also tacked on there is just kind of reassurance that you can afford to play this card when you get to 6. You can fall a little bit behind and then play the 7, gain the 7 life while also doing something relevant. Really, I only want to play this card if A, I have something that needs me to ramp up to 9 or 10, or B, if I have landfall triggers that are good enough that I want to trigger them multiple times. This is sorcery speed, so you're not doing instant speed 3 times land triggers, but I think Nissa's Renewal is a real card in this set, whereas it would be a quite bad card in other sets. Alright, Beastcaller Savant, 2 mana 1/1, haste, ally, 2 relevant things here. Add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, spend it only on creature spells. So yeah, it's not a 1 mana elf, but 2 mana haste means you can attack with it, I guess, and ping 1 damage. But the really, you want to play this on turn 2, and haste is not always going to be relevant, but I do like that being an ally and haste means that in the late game, it triggers rally, it gets some sort of ability from your other allies, and then it has haste to be able to attack with that ability right away. For instance, if it's something like +2/+2 off of the 5 mana ally, then this becomes a 2 mana 3/3 haste. Situations like that, which are kind of clutch. Most of the time, you just want to play this for turn 2. On turn 2, do nothing with it, and then use it to ramp on the following turns. It is only for creature spells, so it's not going to help with a lot of your Converge sorceries and instants, but there are creature Converge cards as well, and this will definitely help you with it. Fits right into the ally deck as well, letting you splash multiple colors easier. This is a very good card, I think. I think it's being underestimated a little bit because it's not a 1 mana ramper, and it's a little bit of a restricted ramper, but I think it's still a good ramp card in general. Alright, and then we get a bomb here. This is, in my book, the definition of a bomb. 4 mana, 2/2, which looks sad, but let's read. Vigilance and Trample, so 2 decent abilities, and Converge when it enters the battlefield, it enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So this is what you want in your Converge cards. If you spend 4 mana, the full 4 mana of different colors to cast this, you're getting a 6/6 Vigilant Trampler for 4 mana. Like I said, though, 75% of the Converge cost is kind of where we want to be with these 4-drops. But even if you're paying 3 different colors to cast this guy, a 5/5 Vigilant Trampler is still insane for 4 mana. And even in a 2-color deck, that's kind of as low as I would go. Even in a 2-color deck, you get a 4/4 Trampler with Vigilance for 4. So at its very worst, and I'm not counting for only spending green to cast this, which you still get a playable card out of. But at its very worst, what we want is 2 different colors. That would be fine. But 3 to 4 colors, and you get an absurdly good 4-drop. It is worth noting these Converge creatures, if you're using Eldrazi Scion to ramp them out earlier, they become worse because the Eldrazi Scion takes the place of a colored mana you could be using. But in a deck that can support 3 to 4 colors, Woodland Wanderer is a insanely good, valuable green drop. Alright, a couple more, I think 3 more here. Orin Reef Hydra is our green rare cycle guy. We get a 6 mana 5/5, which is fine, with trample, which is great. The landfall gives it a +1/+1 counter, and if forest triggered the landfall, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. So this is usually going to come down on turn 6. If your opponent doesn't have an answer for it, it'll most of the time become a 7/7 on the following turn with trample, or a 6/6 trampler. So this is a very good card to ramp out early, using creature-based ramp. That way you can conserve your lands and start adding counters to this guy. Green is probably the best color to make use of these landfall cards because you can get out this Hydra much earlier than turn 6 and then use the extra lands you don't already have in play to make this guy huge. This is a very good card, I think. I think it is a bomb, and I would be happy first picking it. I would not move into green for it in, say, second pack, but it is a strong card on its own. Alright, and then our 2 green mythics. First off, Undergrowth Champion is a champion, I mispronounced that, is a 3 mana 2/2 elemental. If damage would be dealt to Undergrowth Champion while it has a +1/+1 counter, prevent that damage and remove a +1/+1 counter. With landfall, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So assuming you can continually trigger landfall, this guy is going to either get really big or he's going to be a roadblock for your opponent. We've already seen other cards, for instance, the Retreat or the 2 mana 2 counters. We've seen other ways that green has to put +1/+1 counters on it. If you first pick Undergrowth Champion, I would take as many of those counter cards as possible, because every counter you put on this makes this guy unbelievably strong, and he naturally gets counters off of landfall. So even though this guy starts off a little bit on the weekend, he becomes very good. I think this is realistically a 4 mana card because you want to be able to play it and then immediately protect it by putting a counter on it. So if you just run it out on turn 3 when you've already played your land, he's coming out without a counter. Notice this is also not just combat damage. It prevents any damage, so if your opponent tries to burn it or use one of the white damage spells on it, it will remove a counter instead, which means your opponent's going to have to use multiple resources to get rid of this. If you can ramp out lands a lot quicker, this guy gets out of hand very quickly. It is worth noting, every time it gets chumped, it removes a counter, though. For instance, if your opponent's just throwing Eldrazi Scion into it, it is losing counters off of it. So it's a little bit back and forth, but I think the potential for it to really mess up your opponent's plans and the potential for it to just get out of hand as an attacker are very good. A very good first pick and a pretty good build around. And finally, our other green mythic, Green Warden of Merasa. This is a 6 mana 5/4, so the stats are decent for 6 mana. When it enters the battlefield, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. When it dies, you can exile it and return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a lot of value out of one card. If it gets exiled immediately from whatever your opponent used to get rid of it, you don't get the second trigger. It has to go to the graveyard, and you have to choose to exile it instead. But this guy accounts for a huge beater. He immediately gives you value by returning a card to your hand, and then when he dies, he gives you more value. So this guy accounts for a lot of value over the course of a whole game. Your opponent's going to be a little bit reluctant to kill this guy or to throw creatures in front of it that trade with it if you have something in your graveyard that's very bad for them. So this is what you want in a late game green drop. This is, in my opinion, this is just an insane card. The immediate value you get off of it, this is a lot like Polaka Worm in that it waits till the late in the game to play it, but once you play it, you get immediate value, and then you get more value when it dies. It doesn't give you life like Polaka Worm does. It basically draws you 2 cards, and you get a lot of selection as to what cards are coming back. So I'm taking this card all the time. Even if I'm not in green, I'm probably taking this card, and I'm trying to find a way to go into green for it. I think it's just that insane. Definitely one of the best mythics I've seen in this set so far, outside the Planeswalkers, of course. Between these two, I'm leaning towards Green Warden as being the better card, but I will let you guys make that call. So let me know in the comments below what you think between these two mythics and some of the other cards we've talked about. What do you think are the best green cards? And what will you be excited to pull here? What do you think of the combat tricks in green? And what do you think of the instant speed landfall cards? Let me know in the comments below. Keep watching. I'm going to finish up with the lands multicolor card.